Hi folks, I'm Nikki from the University of Wolverhampton, and over recent months throughout lockdown I've been bringing you some creative tutorials to help support you through your homeschooling and keep an element of creativity in your life. Today's tutorial is aimed at Key Stage 3 and above and is a brief introduction to the concept of layering in the digital darkroom. There are two things I always tell my learners when teaching image processing. One is to layer up, the other is just to play. It's often the case that those who have never used a particular software before tend to get the best results from it. This is because they don't have preconceived ideas about set ways to apply a process, and because they experiment to explore the software and find out what they can do rather than thinking about where the limitations are. With that in mind, whilst I'll be using Adobe Photoshop throughout this tutorial, I'll try to stick to processes that aren't exclusive to this software, so you'll be able to adapt them to whichever software you choose to use. The only criteria is that your software needs to have the ability for you to work in layers. There are lots of reasons that we might choose to process in layers. One is so that we can undo or make changes to something we did earlier, either because we made a mistake or because we changed our mind. There's only a finite amount of times that you can click undo. Another is so that we can create relationships between different parts of an image, or even use multiple images in order to create a single composite. Today I'm going to introduce you to a couple of very simple processes to get you started with working in layers. You will need a device running an image processing software that allows you to work in layers. Examples are Photoshop, GIMP, PaintShop Pro, Affinity Photo. If you're stuck, Photoshop provides a free trial for a limited period. You'll also need a selection of images to play with. The first technique I'll show you is a very popular one. It's a bit cheesy, but people tend to love the effect, and you'll definitely have seen this done either with New York scenes with yellow taxis or London scenes with red phone boxes. It's called Selective Color, which involves making most of an image black and white, but using a controlled amount of colour in order to draw attention to a particular area of the image. Once you've loaded your chosen image into your program, you'll need to find out how to make a copy of this layer. In Photoshop I have two options, a drop-down menu at the top of the screen and a layer palette at the side. I need to duplicate this layer. Now anything I do to the top layer won't be applied to the bottom one, so if I make this top layer black and white, you can see from the thumbnail and the layer palette that the background layer is still in colour. Now I need to erase the area of the top layer where I want to bring back colour. Photoshop has very quick options for this process, but as I'm trying to show you in a way that you can apply to your own software, we're going to do this manually. That said, most softwares will have quick select and erase tools, which will be easy to find. Instead, I'm going to use my touchpad and the eraser tool, which I'll set to a low opacity of around 6%, and I'll show you why. Opacity is the opposite of transparency, so if at 100% I'm removing 100% of this top layer. If I show you quickly, you'll get an idea of the effect we're after, but it has a really hard, unnatural line around it, which will be really untidy when we come to the more intricate areas. But at 6%, I'm removing 6% of the layer with each click, giving me far more control. It'll take longer, but it allows me to work up a gradual transition from colour to monochrome. I can also choose just how much colour I want showing through. Leaving a low percentage of the monochrome layer intact adds a matte effect to the image, which helps to tie the layers together. Of course, by selecting the lower layer I can fine-tune the colour selection however I like, using any of the programme's available options. The second layering process I'm going to show you is another really commonly used one. It's known as double or multiple exposures. This time we'll work with two different images, so we're going to need to open them both in the software and copy and paste one on top of the other. You might need to resize accordingly. This is a really quick technique. There are far more complex ways that you could apply this dependent on what software you're using. For example, you might choose to contain one image within the silhouette of the other. However, for the purpose of this really brief tutorial, we're going to keep things simple. Over on the layer palette, we can adjust the opacity for the entire layer, allowing the background to show through. You could just leave it like this if you're happy with the effect. You've already made a double exposure. Depending on your software, you might be able to apply filters which change the way that layers react with one another. In Photoshop, these are called blending options. It's a simple case of skipping through to find something you like for a particular image. Screen and multiply often work well for double exposures. When you've finished your layered image, don't forget to save it. You may need to change the format. For example, Photoshop will automatically want to save it so you can come back and edit your individual layers. You'll need to change this to JPEG or PNG, for example, so you can store, print and share it as a finished image. I hope you've enjoyed this brief introduction to layering and that this tutorial gives you the confidence to explore the digital darkroom in more detail.